It's 10 a.m. on Tuesday, May 30th, 1905. Construction in the Gunnison Tunnel has been progressing for the last 5 months, but the first deadly accident of the tunnel's construction has just occurred. The first, unfortunately, of many that would occur over the next 5 years. There's just been a cave-in that was more like an explosion than a slow avalanche. It's pitch black. The soaking adobe mud and timbers have come to a halt, and here we find one Charles Smithley, buried, alive, and somehow with air to breathe. Having taken a moment to let his inner ear tell him which direction is up, he notices he's holding another hand. Giving it a squeeze, he gets a quick response. Someone else has survived. And with every ounce of strength, Smithley kicks, fights, digs, trying to reach up the arm of his companion to his face, to no avail. But then he hears something.
Smithley! Yeah! Smithley! Smithley here! Help! Help!
Then, just silence. And blackness. 2 more hours pass. And finally, the hand, once comforting, now no longer moves. Then, within minutes, grows cold. And here, something incredible happens that only those that have experienced it understand. The will to live takes over, and Smithley fights. Fights like a mom lifting a car fallen on her son. Fights like the prey animal escaping the jaws of death. Smithley scrapes, wriggles, digs, and pries himself down to where it feels like the dirt is looser. The tunnel has a trench on one side of the floor where water infiltrating the tunnel is channeled out to drain. They call it the boxing. Here, Smithley finds an opportunity, his chance to live. Somehow, water in the boxing is still flowing and moving some dirt. He finds if he wriggles his body down into the boxing, there's enough loose dirt that he can make the tiniest bit of forward progress. He finds the only way his fighting and squirming make any forward progress is if he puts his face down in the boxing, using his skull like a dull drill bit to push forward. Then, unable to hold his breath any longer, he turns his head and lifts his mouth just out of the water to breathe. Somehow breathe through the clotted adobe mud. Then, restoring a modicum of oxygen to his muscles, he buries his face again in the flowing water and fights forward, inch by inch by inch by inch. His only hope are the voices he heard now hours ago.
Hi, my name is Brody Wilson, and I live in the Uncompahgre Valley. I'm a mechanical engineer here in Colorado, and I work in corporate sustainability. But having grown up right next to the primary canal that carries Gunnison Tunnel water, my life was shaped and infused by the water that flows through this tunnel. This is the second of 4 episodes in which I'm telling you the story of the Gunnison Tunnel and associated canals, collectively known as the Uncompahgre Project. In the last episode, we covered the tunnel's conception and the daring early survey work. In this and the next episode, we'll cover the construction of the tunnel. And in the 4th and final episode, we cover the system's operation and impact today. I'm telling this story because most of us take our water for granted. And for those of us that live in the arid western U.S., there's a story like this behind every city, town, and agricultural valley in the West. And while water is sure to remain a crucial issue for decades to come in the Colorado River Basin, I think we'll all make better decisions if we understand just how much has gone into enabling our water use, our way of life, really. Let's continue our story. In Chapter 1, we left off with the daredevil adventures of Torrens and Fellows. Having collected engineering knowledge that a tunnel was possible, it was time for the politicians to do their thing. Remember, though, there are still people that think this idea is impossible. Nevertheless, several representatives and senators in the Colorado state legislature were pushing for the state of Colorado to fund the tunnel. There was an idea that they might get the thing built on the super cheap using state prisoners as labor. And Meade Hammond, the state rep from Delta, introduced House Bill 195 on April 11, 1901. And others in the Colorado legislature bought in. And $25,000, only half of what Hammond had asked for, was appropriated for detailed surveys and to begin construction. It was a super important bill for several Western Slope legislators, including one guy, Senator Buckley, who, despite being confined to his hospital bed with tuberculosis, was carried to the Senate chamber to vote in favor of the bill. Man, again, with the perseverance of these folks. But I gotta say, I wonder how many people he infected with tuberculosis casting that vote. Jeez. It was going to be called State Canal Number 3, and they were planning a route further to the north downstream of where the tunnel is today. The state plan was kind of wild. It actually involved digging 2 tunnels. This is really best seen on a map, but they were going to build a dam at the Falls of Sorrow, what we now call the Narrows today, and first bore a tunnel to the northwest in an area where the canyon does a hard dogleg to the west. The first tunnel would emerge high on the canyon wall, but still in the canyon, actually immediately across from what's called the Painted Wall today. Then they planned to build an aqueduct along the canyon wall for about 1.7 miles. Then finally head west through Vernal Mesa in a second tunnel. This one is about 3.8 miles long. It would have been a total of about 5.4 miles of tunnels plus the 1.7 miles of aqueduct high on the canyon wall. It was complicated, to say the least. You can check out the maps I made showing the locations of all the aspects of the story in my accompanying write-up. And so, on November 21st, 1901, they started digging the tunnel for the State Canal Number 3. It was just 93 days after Fellows and Torrance finished their expedition. The convict labor thing ended up not really working out because of, quote, unforeseen costs related to the construction of a stockade for the prisoners or other, quote, legal reasons. The historical record is unclear. The idea all along with this state-funded effort was to attract private investment to build the tunnel. Everyone knew $25,000 wasn't going to be enough. But alas, and to no one's real surprise, the project ran out of money. But a state engineer's report in 1902 showed that they actually made really good progress. 835 feet of tunnel were dug and timbered on the west or the Uncompahgre end, including 2 ventilation shafts and 5 miles of wagon road to get to the site. The site, of course now abandoned, is still there and is noted on older topo maps in the area. But look, thankfully, for all of us residents of the valley, the wheels of Western expansion and reclamation were really rolling back in Washington. Yeah, reclamation, like reclaiming the land and the water back from nature for human use, reclamation. Newly elected Teddy Roosevelt and the House of Congress were ready to invest real money into building economic opportunity for our nation in the West. And on June 17, 1902, the Reclamation Act was passed, and the U.S. Reclamation Service, now called the Bureau of Reclamation, was formed. Now, thanks to the work of one Congressman, John C. Bell from Montrose, who had introduced a separate bill to fund the tunnel a year earlier, funding for the Gunnison Tunnel Diversion Project was included in the Ultimate Reclamation Act of June 1902. The feds had stepped in and stepped up big time, ultimately committing $6.7 million to the project by 1923, funds far beyond anything local investors, private equity, certainly citizens of the valley, or the state of Colorado could have ever come up with. But this wasn't a handout. The federal monies released for this project were in the form of a zero-interest loan. The shareholders of the recently formed Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association would have to pay the taxpayers of the United States back, every penny. And they did so over the next several decades. The Gunnison River Diversion Project, as it was referred to at the time, was one of the, quote, first 5 projects included in and funded by the Reclamation Act of 1902. The others were the Milk River Project in Montana, the Newlands Project in Nevada, the North Platte Project in Nebraska and Wyoming, and the Salt River Project in Arizona. The following March of 1903 now, the U.S. Secretary of Interior authorized $2.5 million for the project. And just 2 days later, the Colorado legislature authorized the transfer of all of the property and other rights associated with State Canal Number 3. And in that summer, a character emerges into our story that plays a major role. Ira W. McConnell, a graduate of Cornell School of Engineering and the U.S. Geological Survey engineer resident to the area at the time. McConnell is 31 years old and is placed in charge of the topographic work for the project in June of 1903. There was really no other work for the project at the time, so he was kind of the guy. Now, Ira McConnell was also insanely brave and daring, just like Torrens and Fellows from our last episode. In fact, McConnell had spent the previous summer of 1902 risking his life, basically rappelling down into the canyon around the Falls of Sorrow to perform critical surveying tasks with a few other brave souls, all USGS engineers. Remember, these guys didn't have the same kind of nice climbing gear we have today. They're basically sliding down fixed ropes to get where they need to be. Throughout these survey efforts, these guys were climbing from the rim of the canyon to the river's edge every day for weeks on end. If you've never done it, be careful. Climbing 2,000 feet of vert in less than a half a mile is very difficult. So McConnell, 31, having been teaching and running civil engineering projects all over the country at this point, and apparently his recent survey work of the canyon earned him a nickname of Gunnison McConnell, he, through a series of events we'll cover, ends up being the chief engineer of the entire Gunnison Tunnel project. The New York Times had this to say about him at the time.
The next man on the scene was I.W. McConnell, now constructing engineer of the Gunnison Tunnel, and better known in the service as Gunnison McConnell. Folks out there sized him up as a shy sophomore. Now they take off their hats to him. They find fault with him for only one thing, however, which is that he is not given to talk.
Now, here was a guy who clearly thought that actions speak louder than words, and apparently he lived by that motto. He wrote an article for the first annual Conference of Engineers of the Reclamation Service. In this report, he very plainly describes their surveying efforts from the summer before around the Narrows or the Falls of Sorrow, wherein they thought they'd dam and divert the water for the State Canal. He describes which trails they took and how they rappelled down to key survey points. And when I follow his descriptions closely from a perspective down in the canyon, the kinds of things these guys were climbing with nothing but a rope was crazy. I'll include a link to McConnell's report in the show notes so you can read it if you're interested. Have you ever worked really hard on something, like for years, invested your professional credibility in it, and then changed your mind? Decided that you'd actually been going down the wrong path? Well, that's exactly what Ira McConnell did. After working for nearly a year, risking life and limb, surveying in excruciating detail the dam site for State Canal No. 3 at the Falls of Sorrow, he stepped back, and during the winter of 1903 and 1904, while poring over his and all of the other survey data, he took a bigger perspective and realized that their plans and that of the previous state engineers were unnecessarily complicated. While the Falls of Sorrow were indeed an attractive dam site, there was a site about 5 miles upstream that, while a much wider section in the canyon, simplified many of their engineering and logistical challenges. Interestingly, this was the site recommended by Fleming and Wynera. Remember those guys from our previous episode? The lower Falls of Sorrow site required 2 tunnels and a complicated flume. All of the equipment and materials for the dam would have to be lowered into the canyon by cable car. A road was out of the question. The upstream site was significantly higher, allowing for more of the Uncompahgre Valley to be irrigated. So, Ira McConnell, like any wise engineer, sought the professional opinion of a board of his peers, and they visited the site together on May 9th, 1904. Together, this group agreed with McConnell's recommendation that the upper boat landing location was indeed a better decision. And with that decision, they abandoned the approach McConnell himself had spent the last summer daringly surveying. So, with the site of the tunnel selected and the $2.5 million approved that summer, Ira McConnell and the Gunnison Tunnel were off to the races. As anyone in project management for a big construction project knows, there is a ton of work to be done before you can break ground. For this project, there was fundamental infrastructure, communications, contracts that all needed to be in place before a single foot of tunnel could be excavated. So McConnell and his team spent the rest of that summer of 1904 performing detailed surveys of the valley, as well as of the newly selected boat landing location, and they surveyed a road from the rim of the canyon down to the boat landing location. This road was essentially complete by October 1st, 1904, less than 5 months after the East Portal location was selected. The road is a feat of engineering and construction in and of itself. It was dug primarily by hand, like with picks and shovels, also dynamite, lots of dynamite too, and at times reaches grades of 23%. Look, if you're looking for a thrill, you can actually drive this road today. Just be sure to keep your car in first gear. And I dare you to imagine doing it with a horse-drawn carriage carrying a ton of coal. It's a dicey proposition. That summer was also full of paperwork for Mr. McConnell, doing the actual engineering of the tunnel. How steeply should it slope? How big should it be? Where exactly should it emerge from Vernal Mesa? Remember that point A has to be higher than point B if you want water to flow from A to B. And so every decision about the tunnel location and slope had cascading ripple-through implications affecting the engineering of the canal system that would distribute the water. Ira McConnell and his growing team had to engineer the tunnel before anyone could even begin to design a canal. The summer of 1904 was also busy preparing requests for proposals and specifications so potential contractors, the guys that would actually dig and build the tunnel, so that they could actually know what they were being asked to build. I went to the National Archives in Broomfield, Colorado to look at the records stored by the Bureau of Reclamation on this project, and they were so fascinating. I'll include images of some of these materials in the write-up for this episode. One particularly fascinating document I found was a tabulation of bids for the Gunnison Tunnel. The one I saw was a blueprint, like an old-fashioned copy of the original, and still, 120 years later, it reeked of the chemicals used in the blueprint process. This bid tabulation shows the breakdown from 10 bidders, with all of the pricing based on a cost per linear foot, and they broke those costs by the type of soil they thought they'd be digging through, right? It's easier and cheaper to dig through soft adobe dirt than it is to dig through hard granite. Note, I didn't say that it's safer to dig through adobe. Bids were received from companies as far away as Pittsburgh and as close as Denver and Pueblo. Their total cost for the tunnel and the approach cut on the West Portal ranged from $2.4 million to $1 million. Now, that's quite a spread. Some people looked at this project and said, yeah, I think that'll be about $2.4 million. And the low bidder, a company called Taylor Moore from Texas, they say, nah, we think it's only $1 million. And guess who the Reclamation Service awarded the contract to? That's right, Taylor Moore. They were reputable, and in a letter sent back east by McConnell, he said that all of their cost assumption checked out with his, and so they got the job. At the same time they were bidding and negotiating the tunnel contract, they were designing and requesting bids for the canal system as well. And in all instances, at least that I found records for in the National Archives, McConnell and team always selected the lowest bidder. And those low bidders were often lower by significant margin. The other piece of work they did that summer was to build a phone line from the boat landing site, now called the East Portal, over to the West Portal and on to the Reclamation Service office in Montrose. While easy for us to overlook today when communications over a distance is taken for granted, this phone line would be essential for the success of the project. And I understand that this was an actual phone line where your voice could be transferred over the phone, not just a telegram line for sending text via Morse code. Still, if you wanted to send a message long distances at that time, say back to DC, that had to go via telegram, Morse code over physical wires for thousands of miles, or in the physical mail, what we call snail mail today. So after a busy summer of road construction, engineering, contracts, and procurement paperwork, the tunnel contract was awarded to a construction company from Hillsboro, Texas, called Taylor Moore in January of 1905. The contract called for excavation and lining of 30,582 feet of tunnel, that's 5.8 miles, and a cut at the West Portal of nearly 2,000 feet long. It was estimated that the tunnel would cost $1 million and would be completed by April 15, 1908. Contracts were also awarded for construction of the 3 major canals, which, associated with the other open-air features, meaning not the tunnel, would cost about $1.25 million. Note that the canals already cost more than the tunnel itself. A U.S. Reclamation Service office was built in Montrose, an historic building that is now the office of the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association. as well as basic shelters for workers on the West Portal and East or River Portal. And on January 11th, 1905, they broke ground at both ends of the tunnel. But wait, who's going to build this thing? This is a huge project. Even if you took every able-bodied man in the valley, you wouldn't have the labor or skill to get the job done. It turns out that people came from all over the world to build this tunnel.
Hi, my name is Elaine Hale-Jones, and I'm a fourth-generation native of the Uncompahgre Valley. As part of this episode, I'm going to share some of my own family's history as it relates directly to the construction of the Gunnison Tunnel. Two of my great-grandfathers on my mother's side moved to the area in the early 1900s. Both left good-paying jobs, were married and raising families, and came with one goal in mind: find steady employment at one of the first federally funded projects to reclaim arid lands for agriculture, the Gunnison Tunnel Project. The irrigation project was located along the eastern and western boundaries of the Black Canyon Gorge. But most importantly, they came with a vision to eventually homestead land and provide more opportunities for their children. Before I tell you more about their remarkable journeys as first-generation Americans, let's set the stage. Following much publicity about the removal of the Utes from the valley in 1881, this isolated area was now open for settlement. From its earliest beginnings, Montrose attracted a diverse group of people, some coming from the East Coast and Midwest. The construction of the Gunnison Tunnel, in particular, drew a large number of European immigrants to the area, including many skilled craftsmen. These early pioneers were met with a dry, windswept landscape and limited water resources. Remember, large-scale agriculture and efforts to make the semi-arid desert bloom were dreams of the future. It was a land perhaps best described by early-day cowboy Sidney Jochnick in his book, Early Days on the Western Slope. He recounted one of the first cattle drives into the Uncompahgre Valley from the east in 1875.
On the following day, under a blazing sun without water for ourselves or horses, we started out on the downgrade along Cedar Creek through blinding clouds of dust. Dust was everywhere, a dust that was all-pervading, emphasizing the dry season. The herd stampeded in a beeline for what was undoubtedly the Uncompahgre River. As they bounded along with lowering horns and elevated tails, the herd resembled a multitude of tumbleweeds seen upon a prairie on a windy day.
A similar landscape greeted my great-grandparents Laura and James McCarrick when they moved from Denver to Montrose in May 1905. Here's how their journeys began. James immigrated to the United States from Montreal in 1876. An only child, orphaned at age 12, he came to Denver by way of Minnesota, traveling with an uncle. He later worked as a motorman for the Denver City Tram Company. My great-grandmother, Laura Perlake, also immigrated to America in the same year. She was one of 7 sisters who came to America before the turn of the century, leaving behind their native homeland of Pomerania. That's the northern region of Germany near the Baltic Sea. And this was following the deaths of both their parents. Eldest sister Augusta made the first voyage to America in July 1871 and traveled by train to Denver, where she found work with a wealthy family as a domestic servant. When she had saved enough money, she sent for the next sister in line, and so on and so on. Amazingly, my great-grandmother, Laura, was only 12 years old when she sailed to America, accompanied by her 17-year-old sister, Franziska. They too made their way to Denver and also found work as domestic servants. At the age of 18, Laura married James McCarrick in Denver, and they started their family. With news spreading about the Gunnison Tunnel project and an opportunity to find land to homestead, James, Laura, and 4 of their children traveled to Montrose by train in May 1905. All of their personal belongings, including an upright piano, which we still have in the homestead house today, marble-topped furniture, a plow, and a cow were loaded onto a single boxcar for transport. When the family arrived at the train station in Montrose, there were no relatives or friends to greet them, nor was there any form of transportation waiting to take them to their final destination. Faced with few options and leaving their prized possessions on the platform, the family walked 5 miles from the depot to available land located east of town near Cedar Creek. Soon after their arrival, James found work at the Gunnison Tunnel. In the meantime, the family lived in a large tent until a house could be built. During this time, families as well as tunnel workers anxiously awaited the completion of the irrigation project.
Okay, so the McCarricks came from Montreal, Quebec, and from Germany. Pretty typical immigrants, but the lure of free land and good jobs inspired them to take the leap to pursue work in the tunnel.
In 1906, my other great-grandparents, Matilda and Albert Balgart, made the momentous decision to leave their home in Dortmund, Germany, and come to America. It wasn't without some prompting, however. Several years earlier, Matilda's brother, August Calway, had immigrated to America and worked as a tailor in Chicago. Hearing about the rapid opening of the West, he moved to Montrose and homesteaded land on Spring Creek Mesa, west of Montrose. Realizing the vast opportunities here, he wrote to his sister, encouraging the couple to leave the heavily industrialized Ruhr Valley in central Germany. A side note, the rock quarried from August Calway's property west of town was used to build the Montrose County Courthouse, which is now getting a facelift. Albert, a coal miner by trade, took a giant leap of faith and made his way to Colorado in April 1906. He found immediate employment at the Gunnison Tunnel, setting large bridge timbers to help support the inside of the 6-mile-long tunnel, now under full construction. In addition to the grueling work, the language barrier between tunnel workers proved challenging. The majority of his shift bosses were Irish immigrants. He found a place to live at the government town of Luana, located about 10 miles east of Montrose. The area is defined by the infamous east wind, which blows on a regular basis down the valley, drifting snow in the winter and parching the topsoil in the summer. By the way, locals say the wind starts at the top of Uncompahgre Peak and blows with a blinding force to the eastern edge of the city of Montrose. During the summer of 1906, Albert began making plans to send for his family. He sketched pictures of the different denominations of U.S. currency and sent them to Matilda as an aid for her trip. With arrangements in place, the Belgart family sailed from Antwerp, Belgium, to New York City that fall aboard the White Star Line steamship. After 5 days across the rough waters of the Atlantic, young Albert Jr. was the first passenger to see the distant shoreline of America. Matilda made the trip with her 4 children and the 5th on the way. She was 7 months pregnant at the time of their voyage. Another little side note, my grandfather, August Belgart, was only age 5 at the time. He loved to tell the story of the large wooden barrels aboard ship filled with snacks of pickled herring to help passengers avoid severe seasickness.
Okay, hold on. Did you catch that? This mom, Matilda Belgart, has been solo parenting for like 6 months, then sets off with her 4 kids, 5 really, and gets on a White Star Line steamship. By the way, the same shipping line that would launch the infamous Titanic about 5 years later, and sails across the Atlantic Ocean. I kind of thought flying with one young kid was hard. Sheesh.
When Matilda and her children reached New York City, they traveled by train to Denver and then to Salida, where they boarded the narrow gauge train to Luana. The winding track led over the Continental Divide, climbing steep inclines and following the rugged canyons of the western slope. The cross-country trip had been especially difficult since the family didn't speak a word of English. However, the Belgarts found a treat upon their arrival in October 1906, a box of fresh prunes.
So, you know when you see a parent flying with a little kid today, and they're festooned with entertainment, toys, iPads, stuffies, snack packs, wipes, and earplugs for the nearby passengers, and some of us parents look a little stressed out? Imagine this mom traveling with 4 kids, 7 months pregnant, for like 10 days. I don't know about you, but a box of fresh prunes wouldn't have done it for me. I would have needed a pretty stiff drink.
I can imagine my great-grandmother stepping off the train at Luana and surveying the landscape for the first time. With a lump in her throat, thoughts of family and friends thousands of miles away no doubt rushed into her mind. The lush green countryside and well-established towns of her homeland, now only a distant memory. Surrounding her in all directions were sparsely vegetated adobe hillsides, grayish-brown in color, miles of sagebrush, saltbush, and assorted small cacti in an open clearing dotted with small tar paper shacks, the family's new home. And, of course, the east wind.
Well, now you have a picture of who would actually build this thing. We'll get back to the McCarricks and the Belgarts at the end of this episode. Back to the project. We've just broken ground, and for a few months in the spring of 1905, things were looking up. Both crews were making progress from the east and the west. The East Portal Road was working beautifully, getting supplies down to the River Portal crews, or the East Portal crews. Imagine if they had proceeded with the original site at the Narrows and had been moving everything down there by cable car. Jeez. They were working 3 shifts round the clock, the 7 a.m. crew, the 3 p.m. crew, and the 11 p.m. crew. And things were proceeding without any major incidents. A new supervising engineer had been assigned to the project above McConnell, John H. Quinton, a civil engineer from Ireland that had deep experience in big railroad, bridge, and tunnels all over the West, and especially in California. He was basically McConnell's supervisor, dealing with the reporting back to D.C. and handling major contract issues. Quinton was 55 at the time, while Ira McConnell was 32. Now, the first signs of trouble for the project arose 5 months into construction in May of 1905. According to a letter John Quinton sent to the chief engineer of the U.S. Reclamation Service on May 9th, 1905, Taylor of Taylor Moore came to him in the newly constructed project office down in Montrose and, quote, was evidently very much perturbed about something. After talking with him for some time, I discovered that his money matters were not in a satisfactory state, and he seemed so depressed that I became a little anxious about affairs at the tunnel. Accordingly, I promised to go down there with him and did so. He has been doing very good work in the last month at both ends of the tunnel, but it appears that his financial matters are in a very bad snarl. The letter continues to outline the problems. Taylor had taken out huge loans for equipment like boilers, pumps, generators, and air compressors, and was apparently way behind on his payments. His creditors, banks in Montrose and in Denver, and the equipment suppliers themselves were coming after him. Taylor had walked into the project office that day to face the music. John Quinton went to some lengths to sort out the matter and see if he could help Taylor, but as he worked with those owed the most money, an equipment supplier named Lehner Engineering Company, Quinton and the accountants from Lehner Engineering pored over the books, and it became clear Taylor Moore was beyond helping. Their suppliers had had it with these guys. They didn't want Taylor to have any part of the project, as he, quote, has made a very poor handling of it so far. Interestingly, Quinton and McConnell acted quickly to secure the necessary equipment from Taylor Moore before the creditors seized it. This was, after all, their collateral, and had they seized it, it would have brought the whole project to a halt. And so, just 4 days after Quinton's letter back east, it was done. Taylor Moore was out. They waived a 10-day grace period they were allowed in their contract, and McConnell, Quinton, and the U.S. Reclamation Service were now the de facto contractor proceeding under what they called force account until they received further direction from D.C. And while there were certainly some ticked-off creditors, McConnell and Quinton had taken possession of the critical equipment, preserving the project's progress. And the digging continued, 3 shifts a day, round the clock. Taylor Moore's organization wasn't really changed much, and the same men and foremen continued just as they had the day before. Quinton reported as much back to D.C. in an evening telegram to the chief engineer of the Reclamation Service on May 27, 1905. There was much debate about how best to proceed. Maybe subcontract with Lehner Engineering. They had their act together. Or rebid it and find a new contractor. Or maybe just have the Reclamation Service take over directly. And while McConnell and Quinton were sorting through a quagmire of defaulted contracts, angry debtors, and their bondsmen, the Gunnison Tunnel project hopped out of the frying pan and directly into the fire. It's 10 a.m. on Tuesday, May 30th, just 3 days after Taylor Moore is off the job. The West Portal morning shift have been in the tunnel replacing temporary timbers about 340 feet in from their entrance. They're working in a section of adobe soil that McConnell had ordered to be enlarged to the full size of the tunnel with permanent timbers installed. And just then, a guy named Smithley sees a little trickle of sand from between 2 timbers. And he called out instantly to the boys, "Get out!" But before they could scarcely move, they were caught and an avalanche of crushed timbers, mud, and debris. 10 men working on the timber crew are buried almost instantly. The whoosh of air displaced by the falling dirt blew a guy sitting on top of a tram cart off the cart and derailed the cart. This event was closer to an explosion than a slow slumping of material. On that day, the west heading of the tunnel was 670 feet from the west portal, and this cave-in occurred almost exactly in the middle of the tunnel as it was at that time. There had been 19 men working at the face of the tunnel who were completely unharmed, but trapped. Hearing the cave-in, those guys ran back toward the cave-in to figure out what the heck had just happened. Suddenly, the contractual worries of Quentin and McConnell vaporized, and with confirmation that there were workers trapped but alive, they sprang into action. They'd run a steel pipe along the side of the tunnel through which fresh air was being pumped for the crews working at the face. Thankfully, this pipe was not crushed by the cave-in, and ventilation air continued to flow. The pipe was a lifesaver in more ways than one. In addition to supplying breathing air, the trapped workers were able to bang on it to let those on the outside know that they were alive. You could imagine that the guy who'd been blown off his trolley cart might not be so sure that there was anyone alive behind him. Now, with the knowledge that there were survivors, men, their friends, their families, a clock began ticking in all of their hearts. The race was on to save these men. Rescue missions were launched from two sides. No one knew how much of the tunnel was buried. They knew they had made about 670 feet of progress thus far, and that the cave-in started about halfway in, but had all of the tunnel been buried beyond that halfway mark? No one knew. All they knew is that there were survivors banging on a pipe, and the most likely location of any survivors was at the working face where the tunnel digging was occurring, as far from the cave-in as possible. So, the first rescue effort was to dig a shaft from above the tunnel straight down, close to where they knew the face of the tunnel was. Second, and much more precarious, they began pulling the caved-in material, a nasty conglomeration of broken timbers and mud and debris, out of the tunnel from the side of the tunnel that remained open. I say precarious because the ground above was clearly unstable, and it was anyone's guess if when they pulled a broken timber out, it would unleash another torrent of debris. I'm getting my details on this accident directly from a report that McConnell himself wrote. A call was made on the new telephone, and work at the east portal down in the Black Canyon was halted so those crews could come over to help with the rescue. McConnell reports,
No time was lost in starting it, and the men worked as never before in throwing out the dirt with pick and shovel. They changed every 3 minutes, and the shaft seemingly went down with lightning rapidity. At 10:30 the next morning, just 24 hours after the accident occurred, an opening was made to the entombed men.
One factor adding to everyone's urgency was the risk of the survivors drowning. Everyone knew there was groundwater flowing into the tunnel. Was that water filling the tunnel up? Picture tons of guys, maybe about 100, standing around a small hole, rotating through in 3-minute increments, digging for the lives of their companions. They were going full hero mode. In fact, McConnell reports that they eventually got close enough down that they could hear the trapped workers, and they reported to slow down. The crew from above needed to be more gentle to avoid collapsing more of the tunnel down on those guys. The shaft was completed at 11 a.m. on May 31st, just 24 hours after the cave-in. It was about 50 feet deep, and they placed a ladder down into the tunnel. The foreman of the crew, Mr. Grasser, was the first to emerge as he was the weakest of the crew, but for good reason. He had been buried under 9 feet of debris for 9 hours before he got out into the open air with the others. His story is incredible. The tunnel had a small drainage channel dug on the side of the floor, a ditch, if you will, for the water infiltrating the tunnel to flow out. Well, Mr. Grasser was lucky to be pinned down near this drainage channel, and over the course of 9 hours, he, like a mole, dug his way toward his companions in the tunnel. The 19 trapped workers hear Grasser and another man trapped in the debris and quickly began building a dam in the tunnel, trying to slow the flow of water so their companions weren't trapped and drowned. And remember Smithley from the top of the episode? I'll let McConnell tell you how he fared.
Fortune smiled upon Smithley in like manner. When he recovered his senses after the first crash, he found he was holding the hand of someone, which he is sure was that of Schuler, for he was standing near to him. The dirt and mud were pretty tight about him, but he felt all right otherwise. He attempted to remove the dirt from his partner, following his arm up towards his face, but this was impossible, so he held his hand for what he believes was 2 hours, when the hand dropped limply and soon became cold. It was then that he supposes the poor fellow died. Smithley began trying to dig himself out and finally worked into the trough which had saved Grasser. But this time more mud and water had accumulated in the boxing, and it was with the greatest difficulty that he could find room to move himself. He would stick his face down in the water and push ahead as long as he could hold his breath, then raise his face up long enough to breathe. This performance was repeated until he got within about 6 feet of safety. He was then exhausted and could get no further. He called for assistance, and the entombed men came to the rescue. They pushed in a long bar of steel to him, which he grasped, and they pulled him out. The imprisoned men were working all the while, some constructing a dam across the bottom of the tunnel to hold the water, and others shoveling away debris. They kept in good spirit, believing that succor would reach them before perishing. When reached, they were standing in water up to their knees. As soon as they got to the surface, they all started to the portal entry, saying that they were going to aid in rescuing their companions. They were finally induced to obtain food, dry clothing, and rest, as there were plenty of men available for the work.
Okay, the situation on the west portal of the cave-in was unfolding at a much slower and frustrating pace.
On account of the badly tangled timbers and the frequent protests of the men that the work we were doing was shaking earth down upon them and threatening to crush or smother them. Every man that could find a spot to work was in the tunnel, shoveling debris into the cars. Little headway was made here as the dirt came in as fast as taken out. It was a full day before the ground could be held in place. While working there, it was found that some were still alive under the debris, for their calls could be heard distinctly. Every energy was put forth. By Wednesday morning, they had gotten far enough to converse with these men, who were found to be Fred Groff and Ben Taylor. They were pinned tightly, but were experiencing no pain other than the fatigue and distress of lying in one position. Every effort to release them proved futile, as the removal of a single timber might start another slide and certainly kill them. These men believed they could hold out and told the workers to take their time. Another day passed, and still they could not be released. By Thursday morning, the men were very weak, but nourishment was passed into them through openings between the timbers. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the timbers had been braced sufficiently to remove those which held Taylor, and he was pulled out. He simply complained of stiffness and rheumatism, and was exceedingly jovial all the time. 3 hours later, Groff was extricated by placing straps around his ankle, and 6 men pulling him through an aperture which seemed scarcely large enough to accommodate his limbs. He was the weaker of the two, but stood the ordeal bravely. Such bravery and fortitude are seldom witnessed.
Fred Groff and Ben Taylor were removed on the afternoon of June 1st. They'd been trapped among the timbers for more than 50 hours. McConnell wrote a letter reporting to his superiors just after these 2 men were removed that they had removed, quote, hundreds of carloads of dirt, and the end was still nowhere in sight. Of the 29 men trapped by the cave-in, the 19 working at the tunnel face had simply been trapped. Grasser and Smithley on that side had tunneled with their fingernails to safety, and Groff and Taylor on the opposite side were extracted via life-and-death pickup sticks and human tug-of-war.
Unfortunately, not everyone was as lucky.
The crews continued removing the dirt and eventually extracted the bodies of 6 more tunnel workers. Their names were Ackerman, Woodruff, Steele, Schuler, Hornhart, and Cassidy. Several of these are still family names in the Uncompahgre Valley today. As McConnell wrote,
This is the saddest catastrophe that has ever occurred in Montrose County. Hundreds of folk from the valley came to the site to offer assistance.
all told, considering the technology and equipment available at the time and the number of workers trapped, the fact that they got 23 of the men out alive was actually pretty miraculous. What happened? How did a federally supervised project of this scale experience such a terrible accident? In hindsight, the signs are kind of painfully clear. First, the soils in the area are super unstable. The mesa immediately to the south is constantly eroding and sloughing downward, still today. In fact, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad eventually abandoned that stretch of rail, in part because they were struggling with the ground eroding out from under their train tracks so often. And just in case the tunnel crew were not yet enough on edge, there was actually a second cave-in, just 30 hours after the first cave-in, while Groff and Taylor were still being extracted. Talk about unnerving. This time, it was much smaller. A mud flow of about 50 cubic yards fell in, and Cedar Creek ended up running into the tunnel. Remember back from our last episode when I was discussing the Cimarron Ditch and I said, take note, because this Cimarron Ditch water that's now flowing in Cedar Creek will become gravely important in our story a bit later. Well, this is it. Diagrams and reports from McConnell and others show that they had recently changed the path of Cedar Creek above the tunnel in this area. Remember, it's late May. Spring runoff is really ramping up, and Cedar Creek, for the last 3 years, has been carrying more water than it ever had, thanks to the diversion from the recently completed Cimarron Ditch, just a few miles upstream at Cerro Summit. All of McConnell's and others' reports dismissed this second cave-in as inconsequential. It only filled the tunnel with 4 feet of mud in the area. They were playing with fire, and I don't think they even knew it. Spring runoff and new water diversion had, for the last 2 months, been adding large volumes of water to very unstable soils right on top of the tunnel. You don't have to be a geotechnical engineer to know that soils become less stable when they're wet. This area of the tunnel eventually had to be lined with concrete. And look, don't trust me on this.
My name is Mallory McAdams. I'm a civil engineer technically. We're hoping to become a geotechnical engineer. Currently living in Oregon, but I spent most of my life growing up in Colorado. Did my bachelor's and my master's through the Colorado School of Mines.
When I was researching for this project, I found an incredible paper on the civil engineering of the tunnel. The paper was published in 2013 in the American Society of Civil Engineers Journal of Performance of Constructed Facilities, and it was super helpful to me.
Judith Wang, my co-author on the paper, she was my soil mechanics professor. She had this great idea for this paper, and so she's like, yeah, you want to spend a summer just like totally researching this? And I was like, absolutely, that sounds awesome.
Mallory McAdams and Judith Wang both write, Cedar Creek, just south of the as-built Gunnison tunnel line, had been diverted in the restructuring of the natural water streams for the associated canal systems 2 weeks prior to the cave-in to a location nearer to the specific location of the cave-in. Although this fact is not very well documented in the reports from the time, now here comes the wonky geotechnical speak, it is possible that the alteration of hydrogeological conditions very near the cohesionless soils around the tunnel line may have altered the effective stress states and thus the shear strength of the surrounding soil materials. This cave-in happened because there was a lot of water on top of the tunnel, making an area of already unstable soils much less stable than anyone was anticipating. And that water was there from, natural spring runoff and additional water recently diverted from the Cimarron Ditch. I asked Mallory if she thought this was a reasonable conclusion, and she said,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that's 100% what happened.
The team of engineers and workers paid their respects to the fallen, and they went back to work. Many of them walking every day through the section of tunnel that had collapsed and where their friends had just died. As McConnell took over the day-to-day logistics of construction, he found that Taylor Moore had been skimping quite a lot and quickly made requests for more robust equipment, especially electric generators at both portals. The U.S. Reclamation Service did rebid the project that fall in September of 1905. They received 3 bids ranging from $1.54 million to $2.12 million. And the U.S. Reclamation Service's fourth annual report says, quote, all bids were rejected and orders were given to complete the work under government supervision. McConnell and the team got in there and really improved things. By the end of the year, a town of nearly 800 people was built up and called Lawan to support the 350 workers based there, and it had a post office. On the river portal, a workforce of about 150 men had been established with similar amenities, also including a post office.
So it was to these much improved conditions that my family arrived. The McCarricks continued to live on their homestead. They cleared the land to plant crops such as grain and alfalfa and an apple orchard. They also raised turkeys and chickens. In addition to farming, James worked as a caretaker at the west portal of the tunnel. His 16-year-old son, Edward, was a member of one of the last two crews to meet and hole through the tunnel. James McCarrick passed away in 1932 at the age of 76. Laura lived to the age of 93. 10 children were born to the couple. On the Belgart side, during the winter of 1909 to 1910, Albert worked on finishing crews at the East Portal site. This is where the men scaled huge icicles draped across the wooden and concrete frame structures, trying to stay warm in the bitter cold of the canyon depths. Albert's dream of homesteading and farming land came true about this same time. The family constructed a small shack above Lawana on Upper Bostrick Park. The family built a permanent home in 1917 and raised exceptional crops of potatoes, alfalfa, and grains. In 1949, services were held in Montrose commemorating the 40th anniversary of the opening of the Gunnison Tunnel. Albert Belgart Sr. was recognized for having worked the longest on the tunnel construction. Albert and Matilda both lived into their 90s and were the parents of 9 children. Today, 4th and 5th generations still live in the immediate vicinity of the west portal of the Gunnison Tunnel and Bostrick Park. They're carrying on the legacy of immigrants who, over a century ago, dared to dream an incredible dream. And yes, the east wind still blows.
Special thanks in this episode goes, of course, to Elaine Hale-Jones. She's written several books on the history of Montrose and the Black Canyon, and most recently, a book of ghost stories from around the valley. Elaine, thanks so much for sharing your family's story here. And of course, Mallory McAdams and Judith Wang. Mallory spent a long time geeking out with me about the engineering of the tunnel and the amazing civil engineering that went into it. Thanks, Mallory. Also, Richard Elsom is an archivist at the National Archives in Denver. I told him what I was up to, and he pulled boxes and boxes of incredibly valuable records from the Reclamation Service for me, and he helped me understand how to properly cite them. Thanks, Richard. And finally, to my buddy Tim Price, voice acting here as Ira McConnell. Thanks, Tim. That was a nice addition. Okay, that was episode 2. In episode 3, I cover more of the actual construction of the tunnel and what it was actually like for these guys, as well as uncover what I think was the cause for the tunnel's deadliest accident. We'll see you in the next episode.